Maybe it's got something to do with the recent state of the world, but I'm finding myself more and more excited for the latest iteration of the franchise, best known for highlighting the horrors of a pandemic. I'm very excited to present to you my video of huh. It is so frustrating, but I'm forgetting the name of this game. It's the one with the super virus that threatens to end the world. You know, the one that has cities locking down in order to prevent its spread, but it ends up not working. It features a general populace that has a shockingly cavalier attitude towards a small percentage of everyone on Earth dying from an outbreak at any moment. Still no, huh? Oh, right, yeah! Resident Evil! Resident Evil Village is the video game that I'm excited about. Because of this excitement, I felt like offering some speculation into the void. I imagine it'll be rendered just completely pointless as soon as we get the next trailer or demo. It'll probably invalidate everything that I've chosen to assume, and I'll probably be crushed and mortified that I spent so much of my time on something so ephemeral only to look like an idiot. Of course, on the other hand, if I'm correct, the fact that I'm right will offer no comfort because I basically just spoiled the very thing that spurred me to speculate in the first place. And yet, this is what I decided is going to be fun for me in my free time, so let's get started. A not so quick note. Resident Evil is hard to speculate about because its canon is in constant flux. It's malleable. Sometimes soft canon becomes hard canon and vice versa. Sometimes entire entries in the series is outright shunned from the canon until they're not. For example, Resident Evil Outbreak's lore is all but ignored for 15 years, like it doesn't even exist, and bam, lore in Resident Evil 7 confirms that out of the 20 plus ways Outbreak could have ended, this character has definitively survived for what appears to just be a flex, I guess, that they're aware of their own product? And I don't know. Using such an untrustworthy and all-expansive lore to narrow down the quote-unquote correct theory of what's going to happen in Resident Evil Village seems kind of foolish, so I'm not going to drive myself crazy fact-checking what may or may not be canon, because until it's not, everything is canon. Also, instead of hard committing to one theory and building upon it, I'm going to cower it out and speculate using a flowchart of possibilities that lead into other possibilities. I apologize if that makes for a meandering and directionless video. It's just way less embarrassing this way when I make a super wrong assumption about the game, if I've also made several slightly less wrong assumptions about the game. I'm also not going to assume any of what we've seen so far is a drug-induced hallucination, or a dream sequence, or anything of that nature, despite it being a pretty high likelihood because that makes it impossible to speculate around. For me, personally, if I can't trust any of what I'm actually seeing in this trailer, what's even the point of this video at all? That's a fair question, actually. To begin, let's talk about the title for a second. From here on in, I'm going to refer to Resident Evil Village as Resident Evil 8, mostly because it's less of a mouthful, and also I personally think that it's a giant mistake on their part for the marketing. But I don't want to belittle the significance that the subtitle is suggesting, either. It's not the cowardice that you usually see from, let's say, Assassin's Creed, for example, where they've just completely abandoned numbering their entries because they've created way too many spin-offs and people are assuming that only the numbered games were important. No. RE8 wants you to know that it's the 8th entry in the mainline series, they make that very clear in their branding, but they don't want to include it in the official title for whatever reason. The thing with unnecessary yet purposeful omission of part of the title leads me to assume that what they didn't omit is important. A lot of people wrote off RE7's subtitle of Biohazard as a simple merging of American and Japanese titles, when it actually provided a lot of insight about what kind of game it is going to be. In hindsight, anyway. You could interpret that by having the subtitle Biohazard, that they were attempting to go back to the roots of the first game, Biohazard. The game that we ended up getting was exactly that, a spiritual successor to the first game where you're stuck in a giant house, the stakes are much lower, each individual encounter with enemies was way more dangerous, and you're basically just solving a mystery of how this big house got so messed up. At the end of the day, you're just trying to survive an outbreak of Biohazard. My guess is that the branding of Village is trying to express here is that the setting of wherever they are in Romania is going to be significant to the history of Resident Evil, almost its own character like Spencer State or Raccoon City. I'll go more in depth about why I believe this to be true later in the video. Lastly, and a lot more obviously, the subtitle implies that RE8 is going to be a spiritual successor for RE4 in the same way that RE7 was for RE1. RE4 also starts out in a vaguely European village and has you ending up in a vaguely European castle. Ethan's story from 7 to 8 presumably reflects Leon's turn as a small-time survivor to a globe-trotting hero. And yeah, it has the same exact attaché case system from RE4 that we all know and love, and judging by the latest trailer, a traveling merchant too.
Oh, and here's one more piece of key art. You might want to pay extra close attention to this one.
Okay, sure. So let's start with looking at the image that the big corporation definitely doesn't want naughty little consumers like us looking at and work backwards. My first reactions is that it's cool, it's very gothic horror, and honestly I think we're past the point of not trusting Capcom to deliver on a bit of genre hopping. They seem to know what they're doing. Admittedly, there's a slight concern to me that what we're seeing might be treading on territory that was already perfected by Bloodborne, but this is an entirely different genre of video game that I'm sure is hiding more beyond the short teasers that we've seen, so I'm not worried. Moving on, the spooky fetus is what drew my eye first, and believe it or not, it's crucial to a large majority of the theories that I'm hawking, so let's take a closer look. To me, there are two immediate comparisons that come to mind, the first being Las Plagas. Las Plagas, the parasitic organisms that the villains in RE4 and RE5 use to control their army of racial stereotypes, is an undeniable comparison because, like I've said before, we've all but confirmed that RE8 is going to be another spiritual successor. Because the tentacles that are extruding from what is apparently a preserved fetus are reminiscent of Las Plagas, we could possibly see a connection here between whatever is going on in the as of yet undisclosed village in Romania and the undisclosed village in Spain, beyond their similar game mechanics. Still though, Europe's a big place, and the connection of a shared continent is, to be fair, a little or a lot weak. But I think there's more to it that other context clues in this image will help us provide a stronger connection. Speaking of which, the tentacles on our little friend are also reminiscent to the visually updated Nemesis parasite in the recent remake of RE3, and I don't think that's a coincidence. According to the director of Remake 3, Kiyohiko Sakata, we inevitably decided on this final ability due to the presence of Ganado in Resident Evil 4. Ganado are humanoid enemies that are created through being infected with the Plagas parasite, the original basis for any alpha. When the Plagas activates, it spawns from the neck of its host in the form of a tentacle. Any alpha was created to imitate this parasitic quality. So, according to him, Las Plagas was the template that Umbrella used to create the Nemesis. The wording is unclear on how much of the Las Plagas was utilized in the actual development process, but it's certainly no accident that they look similar to each other. Also, the largest tentacle sprouting from the fetus in the image appears to be sprouting from its neck. If this is significant, then we solidified a more tangible connection between all three of these biohazards. I also want to point out that Sakata goes on to state, we wanted any alpha-infected enemies to be visually similar to the Plagas-infected Ganados as a means for fans to piece together how Nemesis fits within the whole Resident Evil franchise. Because Nemesis hasn't been featured in the narrative since Resident Evil 3 where it was introduced, it does leave me wondering what more of a connection to the rest of the franchise is there to piece together beyond what has been plainly stated. My guess for now is a conceptual detail that Capcom has been pushing within the files of the past two remakes, a subdivision within the major bioengineering company known as Umbrella Europe. Before we continue, I'm no expert on the Resident Evil lore, and without a little bit of foundation on the background, the reason for the distinction of a European branch, it wasn't easy for me to follow, so I'll go ahead and quickly provide that for you here. To put it as simply as I can, which is a feat, Umbrella engineered the T-Virus, which you know creates zombies and caused the Raccoon City incident, as a bioweapon, and it wasn't marketable because despite their durability and ferociousness, mindless zombies aren't that practical on a battlefield. Umbrella USA oversaw the development of the Tyrant series, and Umbrella Europe oversaw the development of the Nemesis Alpha Parasite. Both projects were in competition to manufacture a solution, a more practical utilization of the benefits of the T-Virus with more control over the infected. The Nemesis T-type, T for Tyrant, that you see in RE3 is the product of a desperate Umbrella USA utilizing the efforts of Umbrella Europe. done so in reaction to the failure of the prototype tyrant that Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine defeat in Resident Evil 1. Whew. Okay, so with all of that tucked away, there are 3 important points that I'd like to reemphasize. Number 1, Umbrella Europe was involved with both the Nemesis Alpha parasite and the Las Plagas parasite at some point in some capacity. Number 2, the visual similarity of the tentacles sprouting from the neck shared by the parasites and the fetus seem to be a purposeful indication that they are connected in some way. 3, we know that this new threat in RE8 takes place in Romania, which, if it is a corporately produced bioweapon, that would be under the same jurisdiction of Umbrella Europe that the other parasites fell under. These 3 things to me, together, suggest that Umbrella Europe, or just Umbrella in general, is involved with the plot of RE8. A file in Remake 2 tells us that during the Raccoon City incident, Chris Redfield is conducting a clandestine investigation to Umbrella, specifically in Europe, before the events in Code Veronica. So his involvement in this game might be a return of sorts to whatever he was investigating. That feels very likely given his involvement with Blue Umbrella in the last game, and his supposed heel turn in this one. I feel like we're going to be learning something about Umbrella. The question is, what are we going to learn? That leads me to the crow feathers surrounding the fetus, or more specifically, their placement. I'm not going to mince words here, we're just looking at an Umbrella logo. Like, I feel like that's pretty clear. I just don't know why. We also see in the trailer some archaic puzzle type things with the real Umbrella logo that appears to predate the formation of the corporation back in 1967. Even if it doesn't, Red Umbrella is a relic of the past at this point in the timeline, so it's not a new addition. This is one of the most unsubstantiated guesses that I have about this game, but because of these 2 logos and the anachronistic tone of such an old country looking village in the modern day, I feel very strongly that RE8 is going to delve into the origins of Umbrella itself. This image, whatever it is, might be what started it all. So what I've been largely focusing on so far is the connection of RE8 to older games, but I think it's also important to examine in what ways this is a sequel to RE7. After all, Ethan Winters is presumably the protagonist again, so it's a continuation of his story too. Keeping this in mind, what sticks out to me and what has always stuck out to me are the unanswered questions in RE7. I adore how much shit about this game that Capcom has refused to answer but pretended like they did. Like, okay, what's the deal with naming an anti-biohazard gun after perhaps the single greatest supervillain that the Resident Evil universe has ever seen? Oh, well, the people that made it are Umbrella, but they're not the bad Umbrella, they're the blue Umbrella now. And now Chris Redfield is working for them. And Chris Redfield is the person that killed Albert Wesker. So that's why it makes complete sense that it's called the Albert. Oh, I see. Say no more, it all makes sense now. Except, no, none of that explains anything. What it's doing is it's tricking you into asking more questions that they're not going to answer, which is fantastic if you're planning on a sequel. By all means, trick me into releasing all the dopamine you can by answering questions that you planted into my head. Anyway, the specific unanswered question in RE7 that I think has a possibility of being significant in RE8 is the D series. With no fanfare, no explanation, and no origin beyond the mysterious The Connections, it really wasn't much to consider beyond an icky nasty cure for the mold in RE7. But the dry turkey jerky texture of the D series reminds me of something that I've talked your ear off about in this very video. Yep, that's right, it's our friend, the fetus. Now, the visual similarity is admittedly a little weaker here compared to the Parasites, but the fact that they all look like children stick out to me, and it's not the only reason that I'm suggesting the D series might become important. If we make the assumption that what we're looking at is possibly a predecessor or something similar to the D series, then maybe it could provide an explanation for yet another unanswered question from RE7. Marguerite's absolutely horrifying ability to mutate and control insects. None of the other Bakers exhibit abilities that are at all similar, and I can't really think of how being infected with a mold would produce this specific mutation. That is not to say that Resident Evil mutations ever really made sense, but I tend to see the possibility that the cause of this unique mutation was her continued proximity to the D series. Marguerite, after all, was the only one obsessed with protecting the D series arm, going so far as to create a, quote, sacred altar for it and patrol the perimeter. We see in the new trailer one of the, let's just call them vampires, because that's the assumption that they're leading us towards with the shot of that lady drinking blood from your wrist. She explodes into a cloud of what seems to be bugs, which to me seems to be too much of a coincidence to be encountering yet another bug lady in the sequel and not relate that to the entire quarter of RE7 where we were dealing with Bug Lady. So, if Marguerite gets her gross bug powers from the D series, maybe these vampires get their gross bug powers from the fetus, or whatever advances in fetus technology that they've derived from it. And if this is all true, then maybe we'll find out who the connections are, because that's where we've confirmed the D series come from. Because of this, I'd say it's a definite possibility that the consortium of vampires and the connections are one and the same. There's also another vampire trait that the D series could explain, and that's their immortality. We see in RE7 that someone who's infected with the E series and then subsequently treated by the D series has what is essentially immortality with no repercussions whatsoever. This will be a handy tool for later. Okay, so we're past all I can think about for the image itself, so I think it's time to talk more about the trailer now. And what better way to start that off than the biggest shock? Chris Redfield shooting the wife that Ethan Winters spent the entirety of RE7 trying to rescue. First off, do I believe that Mia Winters is actually dead as a result of this? No, not really. We know that Lucas Baker was cured of his mold by the connections before Ethan ever enters the Baker estate, and yet his arm grows back after being cut off right in front of Ethan. So some sort of cellular regeneration does stick around for the victims of the mold. I'm guessing that Mia is also going to share in this ability to regenerate, and Chris's extra little pops into her motionless body might be an indication of that. Also, a trusted source of Capcom leaks has alleged that the developers have been referring to RE8 as Revelations 3, which, if you're not aware, I don't really blame you. The Resident Evil Revelation series is famous for cramming as many twists as the plot will allow, so I think I'll remain unconvinced that Mia is dead or that big fucking hero Chris Redfield is the villain. Because if this is Revelations 3, then this is going to be the first twist in a long line of twists. Still though, I think there's value in entertaining both possibilities. This is where it starts getting complicated. So let's say that Mia is dead is scenario A. Scenario B, Mia's alive, has two explanations that I can think of, so we'll split that up too. Mia's alive because she is still infected and will die without a proper cure. Chris is incapacitating her for her own good and minimizing the risk of her going homicidal like in several moments during RE7. Or, Mia's alive because vampires want her. Chris is either working for them, maybe he's being mind controlled or something, or he's working to keep Mia away from them. I'm basing this on the assumption that Mia's obsession over the creepy story in the trailer with old country vibes is from the old country of Romania, where maybe she's from. That's a lot of assumptions, but it doesn't seem to be too much for each considering what we know about the Winters. Absolutely nothing. We don't know anything about their past. Among these three scenarios, what we know is that Ethan is going to Romania as a result. And that brings us to the question of, why the fuck is Ethan Winters in Romania instead of
Jill Valentine,
Claire
Leon
Redfield,
S. Rebecca
Kennedy,
Chambers,
Sheva
Sherry
Almar,
Birkin,
Jake Mueller,
Elena Harper,
Barry Burton,
Carlos
Oliver
Arcaluciani,
Just
Ada Wong.
anyone more qualified. I understand that Ethan did a gold sticker A+ great job at the Baker estate, but he's not a fucking professional who's equipped to deal with an entire town of vampires and werewolves. At the end of the day, he's just a dude. I just don't buy that the BSAA or Blue Umbrella or especially Chris Redfield would hire and trust a civilian to infiltrate basically what amounts to Old Yarnum all by himself, even if it is his wife in danger. Keeping this in mind, I prepared 4 motives that stem from the 3 scenarios that more believably place Ethan in Romania. A. Revenge, which means that Chris has killed Mia or captured her and taken her to Romania. Ethan in this scenario is chasing Chris to kill him and gets entangled in the plot. B. Cure. Chris has merely subdued a super healing Mia and informs Ethan that as it stands, Mia represents a threat to Ethan and or herself and or the world unless they get the cure from Romania. In this scenario as well, Ethan is chasing Chris, but to help him find the cure instead. C. Legitimate confusion/escape. Ethan has no idea what the hell just happened, and Chris explains nothing. This is probably the most likely scenario. He needs to escape from Romania because the Vampire Collective wants him for some reason. D. Not a civilian. Which means Ethan has been a mercenary dickhead, possibly working for Blue Umbrella this entire time. There's really not much backing up beyond weird line reads like this.
I'm Redfield. Glad we found you.
The fuck took you guys so long?
and the implication that a marriage can't be on the rocks without corporate espionage being involved, but it's there. The idea, I guess, is basically summed up as a much less sexy Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Both spouses are working in the highly specific field of bioweapons, but at least one of them is unaware somehow that the other is working on the opposing side in this arms race. Ethan is in Dulvey, Louisiana, less so to reconnect with his wife, and more so to collect information about the connections and the project that his wife was keeping guard over. This is why Ethan doesn't just immediately contact the authorities when he sees this bullshit before breaking into the estate, and why he has the nearly sociopathic wherewithal to not break and stop being a macho cool guy main character despite everything RE7 puts him through. It basically redefines Mia's "you were right, I was lying" message to Ethan in the intro. It redefines Mia's screaming "you were always watching me, why?" And it redefines the moment when Evelyn tells Mia that Ethan doesn't love her. It also explains the resourcefulness that he exhibits in facing off against fakers. But in truth, I don't really like this theory. It's a little depressing, you know? I want to like the main character of the video game that I like. That and the Winters seem to be living a pretty good life with each other before all the shit in the trailer goes down. They seem happy. I think maybe a nicer version of this theory with a more likable Ethan presents itself when you take the weird line reads at face value as weird line reads. Or perhaps both of the Winters were badasses working for the connections, and at some point they both decided to step away and live a normal domestic life. The deception that Mia made to Ethan wasn't that she was working for the connections, but rather that she had returned to working for the connections without him. We'll just have to see. And that brings us to the fifth and final motive, which addresses an elephant in the room that I've been avoiding because it's a trickier subject to talk about. It could relate to almost everything that I've been theorizing about, and it could have nothing to do with any of it. Basically, in all likelihood, one of the biggest motives we have for placing Ethan in Romania is recovering his child. Yeah, I totally get it. This might be out of left field for some of you, and totally unnecessary of explanation for others, but let's get into it for a little bit. During this shot in the trailer, Mia, in a classic anime mom who's about to bite it haircut, looks like she's reading to a young child. Take a look at her body language. She's sitting up straight, with her neck down, and she's holding the book away from the center of her sight with one hand. This is what you would look like if someone who is smaller than you, small enough to not be seen from behind the couch, by the way, is leaning against you on the opposite side of the book. Mia is also reading a story that seems meant for children. Creepy children, sure, but children nonetheless. There's also a big theme of children in general beyond the creepy story. Symbols of fetuses, artwork depicting a battle for the possession of a baby, which we'll cycle back to, and actual babies are shown throughout the trailer. They also have this establishing shot of a pile of potatoes with roots growing out from its eyes. To me, this looks like a decided representation of new life being born from old. Rebirth. This, by the way, is a theme that the Resident Evil series has a lot of experience pushing. Sure, there's the literal interpretation of the undead rising as an example, but there's also the more metaphoric interpretation with the main characters as well. Protagonists in Resident Evil end their previous lives and move on to the next as someone new. They often find themselves in a blend between a very human and relatable struggle with the less relatable struggle of surviving a zombie attack. For example, maybe you're thrown into a new city, a new job, and it's not what you expect, and your expectations need to die so that you can live your best life in this new situation. Maybe you need to forgive yourself for all the friends that you've left behind before you can start making new ones. Maybe creating a legacy of good is the only way to kill the bad one that's been hanging over you your entire life. Whatever the case may be, the driving force behind most protagonists in the series is rebirth. I fervently believe that it'd be thematically apt for Ethan, someone who has fought tooth and nail to avoid becoming assimilated into a family, to be fighting to protect his own. The new life of his child and his own new life as a father traded in for a past life of death and deceit. As Ethan says in his closing monologue in RE7, this entire series is about one door opening when another closes. There's also a similar running theme for antagonists in the series as well. It's less of a personal journey and more of an outwards endeavor. They wish to kill the old world and reshape it in their own image. Oswald E. Spencer wished to create a utopia via a eugenics program and killed with his bioweapons to fund that program. Osmond Sadler created a brainwashed death cult to infiltrate various seats of power across the world. Wesker wanted complete global saturation of a virus that either turned you into an absolute mess of tentacles or a Superman like him. Nothing in between. Evie wanted to kill and control anyone in her immediate vicinity in order to have the perfect family. All of these villains were willing to let any amount of people die so that the world would change in their favor. For this reason, I'm beyond excited to have vampires as the antagonist of RE8. Why? Because vampires are traditionally agents of stagnation instead of change. Rebirth of their world doesn't interest them because they're going to live forever. The longer they keep things the same, the more things work out for them. They settle themselves into a nice, comfortable status quo, and the conflict in a vampire story usually arises when somebody attempts to challenge it. The time-worn look of the village that they reside over and the time-locked look of the castle that they reside in certainly appears to back up this idea. This is a place resistant of change. As for the methods that they protect the status quo, this is what has me so excited. The antagonist of this game might flip the script completely. Babies appear to be desired by the vampires, as possibly illustrated by the stone relief here. It's hard to make out, but it looks like a swaddled baby that the demon is holding. And if this new desire is to consume them in order to retain their youth, they'd be sacrificing an outwards new life to prolong an internal older one. If all of these assumptions are correct, then what we're dealing with is a very different breed of Resident Evil antagonist, one that we haven't seen before. What they actually do with the babies once they actually have them is still up in the air, and that depends a lot on how Ethan relates to the plot, what the baby jerky really means, and what this stone relief really represents. Are the vampires the scary demon-looking thing on the right stealing the baby, or are they the hero saving the baby from evil? Is this puzzle on the gate to keep the villagers out of the castle, or keep the monsters in? All in all, there's more evidence to suggest that there is a larger baby conspiracy at work here, but not necessarily much evidence to suggest that a Winter's Child could be involved, despite my subjective opinion that it would nicely tie everything together. Still though, it really would. Of course, all this Winter's baby stuff could be bullshit too. Not just bullshit like none of any of this means anything, I readily admit that possibility. What I mean is that this could be the kind of bullshit where it could all just be a trick. Any clues that are leading me to the possibility of a Winter's Child could be the result of the Winters still being under the spell of an Evie that's dead and gone. A phantom image created by the residual mold in their brains. They want you to think that they have a child while revealing that Mia was still crazy when Chris shot her. Okay, well that's all I got for the conjecture portion of this video. I guess I'll leave you with an elevator pitch of how we can get a sequel to the hands down best portion of the last game, Punch-Out with Joe Baker. I really enjoyed the thought of carrying on the tradition of Joe Baker accidentally encountering bullshit from the mainline games and cleaning them up. So, assuming Chris' story is the one coming to a close that they mentioned in the trailer, let's have his corpse transform into a werewolf and Joe Baker, who just wanted to get away to Europe to climb mountains and deal with the trauma of losing his entire family, combats lost werewolves and fights Chris as the final boss. We end the DLC with the final battle between the all-time boxing champ of the swamp and the boulder-punching king of magma on the peak of a frozen mountain. Okay, that's it. See you in a couple days for the Tokyo Game Show presentation.